If you think the Romans were just all about fancy togas and grand amphitheaters, buckle up, because their justice system was a whole different kind of brutal. First up, we have crucifixion, one of the most horrific punishments in ancient Rome. Firstly, the victim was stripped naked and forced to carry a heavy wooden beam to the execution site. Once there, their hands and feet were nailed to the cross, typically through the wrists and the ankles. The nails were not just to hold the person in place, but to cause maximum damage and suffering. The victim's body weight would pull down, dislocating joints and making breathing increasingly difficult. Suffocation was often the primary cause of death, with the victim struggling for air as their lungs filled with fluid. Other causes of death included blood loss or dehydration. The torture could last for hours or even days, with death coming slowly as the body eventually succumbed. To speed up death, soldiers sometimes broke the victim's legs, preventing them from pushing up to breathe. Crucifixion wasn't just about killing someone, it was about sending a message. This punishment was reserved for slaves, rebels, and the worst of criminals, like traitors or those who challenged Roman authority, like rebellion against the state. Crucifixion was reserved for non-citizens, mainly because it was deemed too degrading for those with full Roman rights. The most famous example? Jesus Christ, who was crucified for claiming to be King of the Jews, a direct challenge to Roman rule. By the 4th century, after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, crucifixion began to fall out of favor. Damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was a gruesome spectacle in ancient Rome where criminals were thrown into the arena to face savage wild animals. Typically, this punishment was reserved for slaves, criminals, or Christians. Victims were often stripped and forced to fight against beasts like lions, tigers, or bears, with the animals being starved before the event to make them more vicious and desperate. The condemned person had little chance of survival, often dying quickly from mauling or sometimes facing a long and drawn-out end as the predators toyed with their prey. This brutal punishment was not only a form of execution, but a public display designed to entertain Roman citizens and send a clear message about the power of the empire. The spectacle could take place in massive arenas, like the Colosseum, where the crowd would cheer as criminals met their violent end. Despite its popularity, the practice began to fade in the later stages of the Roman Empire, especially with the rise of Christianity, which condemned the brutal nature of such executions. Forced labor, metallum, was a brutal punishment in ancient Rome, primarily used for those deemed unworthy of a quick death, but still in need of harsh punishment. The term referred to the mines where prisoners were sent to work, suffering grueling and horrific conditions. Typically, those subjected to forced labor were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, forced to provide materials to support Rome's ever-growing military ambitions. Prisoners were made to dig for precious metals, usually in dangerous, unsanitary conditions deep underground. There was little to no light, and the tunnels were often poorly ventilated, leading to a constant risk of suffocation. Workers were frequently exposed to harmful fumes, which could lead to lung disease and death over time. The physical strain was brutal, with prisoners forced to work long hours, sometimes even days on end, without proper food or rest. Their chains would often rub their skin raw, and punishment for even the smallest infraction was severe. Many prisoners perished from exhaustion, injury, or disease. If they managed to survive the grueling labor, it was often only to die young from the physical toll it took on their bodies. Eventually, as the empire's resources dwindled and the use of slaves became more regulated, forced labor in the mines began to decline. But the lasting impact of this inhumane practice is still remembered as one of the darkest chapters of Roman punishment. Decimation was a brutal military punishment in ancient Rome, reserved for soldiers who displayed cowardice, insubordination, or failure in battle. The word decimation comes from a Latin word meaning removal of the 10th, and that's exactly what it entailed. If a unit was found guilty, 1 in every 10 would be executed by their fellow soldiers. This twisted punishment was meant to instill fear and discipline among the troops and ensure that soldiers remained loyal and effective in battle. After a failure in the field, the soldiers would be forced to draw lots. Every 10th man, chosen by lot, was then executed. The condemned soldiers would typically be beaten to death, sometimes by clubs or swords, but the punishment could vary depending on the circumstances. Decimation was employed during times when discipline was crucial, particularly in the early and middle periods of the Roman Empire, when the Roman army was expanding and maintaining order was paramount. Carcer was the Roman term for prison, a dark, damp, underground dungeon designed to break the spirit of those imprisoned within. It wasn't a place of rehabilitation or fair trial. It was simply a holding cell, often used for those awaiting trial or punishment. Roman society didn't have prisons for long-term punishment, so the carcer was merely a horrific stopover for most before they suffered their actual punishment. Prisoners were often kept in chains and forced to endure miserable conditions with very little little food or water. The walls were narrow, the air stale, and disease ran rampant, with your chances of survival getting thinner with each day that passed. Those who found themselves in the carcer were usually either common criminals, political prisoners, or slaves who had offended their masters. The worst part about the carcer wasn't the lack of comfort, but the uncertainty of one's fate. Prisoners might be kept in the dark about how long they would stay or what punishment awaited them. The psychological toll of being confined to such harsh conditions without any hope for release was devastating. Release from the carcer often only came before execution or a fate even worse than death. Damnatio Memoriae was a fate worse than death for many in ancient Rome. Literally meaning condemnation of memory, it was the ultimate punishment for traitors and disgraced enemies of the state. The idea was simple but brutal. Wipe the person from history as if they had never existed. Their statues were smashed, inscriptions chiseled away, coins with their image defaced, and their name forbidden from being spoken or recorded. It was a symbolic execution after death, destroying not just the person, but their legacy. One of the most famous examples was Emperor Geta, the son of Septimius Severus. After a bitter feud with his brother Caracalla, Geta was murdered in 211 CE, supposedly in their mother's arms. Caracalla ordered a Damnatio Memoriae, erasing Geta's face from paintings and sculptures, destroying public records of his achievements, and forbidding anyone from mentioning his name. The lengths taken to obliterate Geta's memory were extreme. Yet ironically, this punishment has ensured that his story survives today as a testament to Rome's obsession with control and legacy. As well as their more famous execution methods, the Romans were also known for burning their victims at the stake, a punishment reserved for those deemed exceptionally vile or dangerous to society. While it was not the empire's most frequent execution method, it left a terrifying legacy due to its sheer brutality. Victims were consumed by flames in front of jeering crowds, their screams reinforcing Roman power and control over the people. Early Christian martyrs were reportedly executed by burning. According to legend, early Roman Christians like Polycarp and Theodore met their fiery ends at the hands of Roman authorities. In some cases, the infamous tunica molesta was used, a garment smeared with wax and pitch, designed to turn the victim into a living torch. Certain other accounts of burning and fire being used as punishment exist in the ancient records, including Constantine's decree that men and women who had intercourse without their parents' consent would be burned alive. Women who had sexual relations with their own slaves would reportedly be punished by death, with the slave being burned alive. Nurses who facilitated sexual encounters for their patients could also reportedly be punished by having molten lead poured down their throats. From religious persecution to enforcing moral codes and maintaining civic order, burning remained one of the harshest tools in Rome's arsenal of punishment, searing both its victims and its spectators with fear. The punaculi, or punishment of the sack, was one of Rome's most bizarre and horrifying forms of execution, reserved specifically for those convicted of parricide, the murder of one's father. Romans viewed this crime as a grave affront to both family and society, warranting a punishment as chaotic and degrading as the crime itself. The process was elaborate and ritualistic. First, the condemned was beaten, stripped, and paraded as a symbol of dishonor. They were then bound and sewn inside a large leather sack, alongside a gruesome assortment of live animals. Once the sack was sealed, it was thrown into a body of water, a river, lake, or the sea, ensuring a violent and chaotic death. The victim would often be savaged by the terrified animals inside the sack as they thrashed in panic. Drowning was inevitable, but not before the victim endured the agony of being bitten, scratched, and pecked by their fellow doomed occupants. The punishment evolved over time. Under earlier Roman law, a simple drowning sufficed for parricides. However, by the late Republic and into the Empire, the ritual became more theatrical and gruesome, reflecting Rome's increasing preference for punishments designed as public warnings. Though the animals often varied, the message remained the same. To kill one's father was an offense that warranted complete obliteration, body and reputation alike, through a death of utter humiliation and horror. And that wraps up our grim tour of Roman punishments. Which one gave you chills? Let us know in the comments. If you survived this journey with us, hit that like button, subscribe for more wild history, and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. See you next time.